60,000 years ago, the world began to freeze. It wasn't a sudden frost or a passing winter. It was an age of ice that would stretch for millennia. Glaciers swallowed mountains, seas turned to frozen plains, and the wind itself became a predator. The planet's surface transformed into a place few living things could endure. Yet, somewhere in that endless cold, a handful of humans, small tribes scattered across continents, learned to survive what nature had designed to destroy. The Ice Age was not kind. Temperatures in Europe fell below -40. Forests vanished beneath the weight of glaciers. Rivers stopped moving, and entire species disappeared. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, saber-toothed cats, they too struggled to find food. For humans, this was the moment that decided whether our species would vanish like so many others or rise through adaptation. We were not the strongest, not the fastest, and not the fiercest. But deep inside frozen caves and wind-beaten valleys, early humans began to turn knowledge and cooperation into tools of survival. In the darkness of the Paleolithic night, small groups of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens huddled together around flickering fires. That fire wasn't just warmth, it was life itself. Every spark represented a victory against the cold that sought to extinguish them. The fire drove away predators, thawed frozen meat, and created a circle of light where fear turned into strategy. These were the earliest survivors of a world on the brink of extinction. Food was the eternal struggle. The landscape offered little. No fruit, no grain, only the frozen remains of animals that had fallen to the elements. Hunting became a test of patience and intelligence. Mammoths and bison roamed the plains, covered in thick fur and fat, walking sources of warmth and sustenance. But they were enormous, dangerous, and often deadly. Hunters crafted flint-tipped spears and stone knives, tools that evolved through desperation and necessity. When a mammoth fell, it meant more than a meal. It meant survival for an entire tribe. Skin for clothing, bones for tools, sinew for thread, and fat for firelight. Every resource was precious. Nothing went to waste. Animal hides were scraped clean, stretched, and stitched into clothing that could withstand the merciless wind. Even the smallest fragment of bone could become a needle, a hook, or a weapon. In this age, invention was not a luxury, it was instinct. The earliest humans didn't have the words for innovation or creativity, yet every act of survival was both. Firelight danced across the walls of their caves, revealing more than smoke and stone. On those walls, they painted visions of hunts, animals, and spirits. These ancient paintings were not mere decoration. They were communication, memory, and ritual. Perhaps they believed that drawing the beasts would bring luck on the hunt, or perhaps it was a way to understand the vast, indifferent world around them. The caves became their sanctuaries, part shelter, part temple, part archive of human thought. The Ice Age sculpted not just the earth, but the human mind. Cooperation became more valuable than strength. A single hunter could not face the cold alone. Tribes learned to share food, to plan hunts, to care for the weak and the old. Through unity, they discovered resilience. Language began to evolve. Gestures turned into words, words into stories. Around those fires, humanity began to find its voice. But survival was never guaranteed. Entire clans disappeared when winters grew too long or prey too scarce. Some sought warmth by migrating south, following the herds across endless tundra. Others perished in their caves, frozen beside the ashes of their final fires. The line between life and death was drawn thinner than the ice above their heads. Archaeologists uncovering ancient bones can still see the evidence of this struggle. Neanderthal skeletons bear marks of healed wounds, proof that their companions cared for them, tended to injuries, and nursed them back to health. In a world ruled by cold and cruelty, compassion became a survival skill. Those who helped others helped themselves. It was empathy, not brutality, that gave humans their edge against extinction. Shelter was another key to endurance. While predators prowled the frozen plains, humans carved homes into the earth itself. Deep caves became fortresses against the storm. Inside, the temperature remained constant, protected from the howling winds. In some regions, they built huts of mammoth bones and hides, structures strong enough to last seasons. The glow of the fire reflected off walls of ivory, a haunting reminder of what it took to live through the Ice Age. Still, there were moments when even the fire could not save them. The cold seeped into bone and blood, slowing heartbeats, stealing breath. Death was constant, quiet, inevitable, and merciless. To live meant to defy nature itself. To die meant to return to the frozen ground, preserved for eternity. Many of the bodies discovered in permafrost today are so well kept that even their final expressions remain. Faces of those who once looked into the storm and refused to surrender. As centuries passed, something remarkable began to happen. Humans started to adapt, not physically at first, but mentally. They began to think ahead, to plan seasons in advance. They stored food, learned to smoke meat, to preserve fat in frozen containers. Their tools became sharper, more complex. They discovered that breaking flint in precise ways could create edges sharper than any animal tooth. The first knives, scrapers, and spearheads became symbols of intelligence, small victories in the war against the elements. Across Eurasia, different species of humans faced the cold in their own ways. The Neanderthals, short and muscular, were perfectly built for warmth. Their broad noses and stocky bodies helped conserve heat. The Denisovans, mysterious cousins discovered only through DNA and a few fragments of bone, thrived in the high mountains of Siberia. And then came Homo sapiens, thinner, taller, but more adaptable. We spread faster, learned quicker, and built connections that transcended survival. Eventually, it was us, our ancestors, who would outlast the others. But the cost of survival was heavy. The Ice Age changed the very rhythm of human life. Days revolved around fire, food, and fear. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with the distant howls of wolves and the cracking ice outside the cave. In those moments when survival seemed impossible, something deeper began to awaken. The spark of imagination. Humans began to wonder about forces they couldn't see. Spirits of the hunt, gods of fire, ancestors watching from the dark. Belief became a form of hope, a psychological shield against despair. Around 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum reached its peak. Ice sheets spread across nearly a third of the planet. Oceans receded, exposing vast new lands that connected continents. The Earth itself seemed to sleep under a frozen blanket. Yet, beneath that surface, the seeds of the future were forming. Tribes learned to trade, exchanging shells, tools, and pigments across hundreds of miles. Networks began to form, invisible threads linking distant families of survivors. The Ice Age had forced isolation, but also invention. It taught humans to reach beyond their caves. Over time, as the climate began to warm, the world shifted once more. Glaciers retreated, rivers flowed again, and forests began to return. For the first time in thousands of years, humans stepped out into a changing world. The skills they had learned in the ice, fire-making, cooperation, adaptation, would now shape the birth of civilization itself. The end of the Ice Age wasn't the end of struggle. It was the beginning of everything that followed. Yet the memory of that frozen era never left us. It remains buried deep within human DNA. The instinct to huddle close when the world turns dark, the spark of fear that drives invention, the empathy that binds us when all else fails. Every modern human carries the legacy of those who faced the cold and survived. We are their children, the descendants of firekeepers, toolmakers, and dreamers of warmth. Even now, when scientists examine the caves of Lascaux, Chauvet, or Altamira, they see more than ancient art. They see a record of endurance. Those painted walls whisper stories older than history, of hunts that fed tribes, of storms that ended lives, of nights spent praying for the sun to rise again. Each stroke of ochre and charcoal is a declaration. We were here. We endured. The artists who made them didn't know that their images would outlast the Ice Age itself. Yet somehow, they captured eternity in stone. The Ice Age shaped the human spirit through suffering and wonder alike. It was an age of scarcity, but also of awakening. It forced us to use imagination as a weapon, to dream of warmth, of light, of a world that could be kinder. Out of that dream came innovation, culture, and community. The same hands that once carved spears would one day build cities. The same minds that once studied the tracks of mammoths would one day study the stars. The bridge between those two moments, from survival to civilization, was built on ice. When we look back now, it's tempting to see those cavemen as primitive, slow, or brutish. But in truth, they were the first scientists, the first engineers, the first storytellers. They decoded the language of the land, experimented with materials, and learned to predict the patterns of nature. They adapted again and again to a world that tried to erase them. Without their endurance, humanity would never have existed long enough to wonder who we are. Imagine standing in their place, the endless white horizon stretching beyond sight, the air so cold it burned your lungs. The only sound is the wind, sharp as a knife, cutting across the frozen plain. In your hands, a spear carved from bone and stone. In your heart, a fragile hope that somewhere, just beyond the ridge, there's food, warmth, life. Every step forward is an act of defiance. Every breath, a small miracle. The Ice Age didn't end because it was overpowered. It ended because the world changed, and humans changed with it. That is our greatest strength, adaptation. From the frozen tundra of Europe to the caves of Siberia and the plains of Africa, our ancestors carried that same fire, both literal and spiritual, across generations. They passed it down, and it burns still, in our cities, our technology, our art, and our instinct to survive, no matter how impossible the odds. The story of how cavemen survived the coldest ice age is not just a story about the past. It's a mirror held up to what makes us human. We endure. We imagine. We adapt. When the world turns to ice, we make fire. When darkness falls, we tell stories. And when all seems lost, we find a way to live again. So next time you feel the cold bite of winter, remember the hands that built the first fires, the minds that refused to surrender, and the hearts that carried humanity through an age of endless night. We are here today because they learned to survive, not with power or cruelty, but with courage, creativity, and connection. The Ice Age may have frozen the earth, but it could not freeze the human spirit. That, above all, is how we truly survived.